Greetings, friends of liberty. Though I suspect my feeling is shared by more than a few Englishmen, as I related to a friend recently, though not within earshot of the assembled company, I must confess to having a slight partialité in favour of French ladies. Now, one might assume I sport with words in speaking of this predilection, but 'tis true. I find that while, of course, English women can arrive at the level of culture and sophistication of French women, usually this requires some effort, whereas French women, from the cradle as it appears, seem possessed of an utter feminine charm and sophistication, unrivaled by our English ladies. Of course, one mustn't speak loudly of such a bias, else one would raise the hackles, or at least the eyebrows, of most ladies within all the boroughs of London. The deeper trouble is, of course, that I fell afoul of this partialité and married a Frenchwoman, Marguerite Saint-Just. Though, truth be told, I dare say I've been well rewarded, in more ways than one, for my gender francophilia. So was it really a prejudice in the end? Or instead, as I prefer, a rather astute ability to discriminate? In any case, we find, oddly enough, if we turn to your 21st century, a fellow Englishman also writing an apology for prejudice, an apology of almost 150 pages. Of course, in your day and age, this takes considerable testicular fortitude, and merely on that score alone he is to be commended. I speak here of the national treasure, Theodore Dalrymple, psychiatrist, social commentator, and public intellectual extraordinaire. His defense consists of 29 short chapters. In each, he deftly articulating and unfolding some aspect of his argument. He begins in his first chapter, as he should, by defining his terms, following the Oxford English Dictionary. Prejudice is a previous judgment, especially a premature or hasty judgment, B, preconceived opinion, or C, an unreasoning predilection or objection. He remarks on this definition by saying, it follows, does it not, that we should strive to be entirely without prejudice? So, for example, some of the worst massacres were motivated, or at least made possible, by it. No prejudice, no genocide. He wants us to note, however, that if the existence of widespread prejudice is necessary for the commission of genocide, it is certainly not a sufficient one. Nor does it follow from the fact that all who commit genocide are prejudiced that all who are prejudiced commit genocide. Since it is commonly held nowadays to be a preventative against being prejudiced, to unsparingly question the validity of all of one's beliefs, and since French philosophical giant René Descartes was famed for doing this, Dalrymple asks, have we then bred up a race of philosophical giants whose passion is to examine the metaphysics of human existence? I hope I will not be accused of being an enemy of the people when I beg leave to doubt it. He believes instead that people question things in authority so much not because they're interested in discovering the truth or often in uncovering their prejudices, but instead because they want to cast doubt on anything or anyone who might question or contradict whatever they feel like doing, which is very different from Descartes. At the same time, he utterly agrees that the slightest acquaintance with history should be more than sufficient to persuade anyone that custom, law, and the wisdom of ages have often been oppressive and worse than oppressive. So it would appear then that he wants to argue that prejudice can be both good and bad, since the preconceived opinions we've accepted, let's say from our parents, could themselves be good or bad. In his chapter entitled The Effect of Pedagogy Without Prejudice, he outlines for us as an example the commonly observed case in contemporary society of parents who can't even make food choices for their children
because they believe that the children, often barely out of the cradle, should already be able to or learn to know what they like themselves. And so he gives us a mother in a shop or a supermarket solicitously and even anxiously bending over a 3 or 4-year-old child to ask him what he would like for his next meal, pointing out, of course, that a child of that age has little basis for making such a judgment. And yet the mother defers to him in her desire not to instill in him her own gastronomic prejudices or values, which deference seems silly and counterproductive. He next transitions to highlighting more positive prejudices, giving us the example of how there used to be a prejudice almost throughout society that families should sit down together or eat around a table. It was a ritual that was entirely second nature to them. Of course, now in England in the lower classes and probably other, this custom has often entirely vanished. As Dalrymple says, many of the prisoners in the prison in which I worked as a doctor had never in their entire lives sat down to eat at a table with another human being. From childhood, they had grazed where and when they felt like it as herbivores on a savanna. The Englishman's street is now his dining room and helps to explain why the streets are so littered. And in closing this chapter on good and bad prejudices, he talks of the prior prejudice against illegitimate children, and the women who bore them, recounting one case that his colleague, in closing down a whole wing of a psych hospital, had discovered in one of the back wards where the doctors seldom ventured, an inmate of nearly 70 years' residence whose only madness had been to give birth to an illegitimate child all those years ago. Here was a life blasted by a censorious, unthinking, and cruel prejudice. But he contrasts this horrendous case with what he regards as a modern prejudice, that a man should never have to marry a woman he's impregnated. As he says, in less than half a century, the prejudice of centuries has been overturned and replaced by another, the unedifying practical consequences of which I saw daily in my work as a doctor. Interestingly, he believes that one prejudice is always replaced by another. He also argues that if we don't instill the proper prejudices or attitudes into our children, this can have very detrimental and even cruel effects on them subsequently, given that their behavior will now often be inappropriate to many social and personal situations. Here he is referring, among others, specifically to the lack of stigma towards illegitimacy and the enormously negative results at a personal and societal level of bringing children into the world without a stable family and father. That result is, admittedly, cruel. Next, he points out the truth that many people who assume that they're breaking taboos and disregarding prejudices and being social rebels by being unconventional are actually being quite conventional. So, for example, people only rarely used to have rips and holes in their jeans to show how little they cared about their clothing, but now many people show the same deliberate disregard for their clothing, so it's very conventional to have holes in your jeans. As Dalrymple puts it, unfortunately, the desire to escape from convention is itself a convention. The mass bohemianization of society has not necessarily resulted in the flowering of worthwhile individuality or cultural achievement. In one of the most important and decisive chapters of the book for the development of his argument, he next attacks part of John Stuart Mill's famous essay on liberty, saying one of the sources of the prejudice against prejudice is John Stuart Mill's great tract on liberty, published in 1851. In this chapter, he recounts Mill's own history under the strict upbringing of his father, who had emphasized the rational aspects of human conduct but ignored the emotional. As Dalrymple says, Mill resolved the problem, at least for himself, by combining the romantic cult of the individual with the puritanical utilitarianism of his father. And then Dalrymple says, staking much of his argument on this very point, and so powerful was this solution, at least rhetorically, that it has been adopted by much of the Western intelligentsia ever since, and through them by entire populations, whether they know it or not. So Mill Jr., at least derivatively, is to blame for the present ills of much in Western civilization and modernity. What does he believe so harmful in Mill's On Liberty? First, the notion of Descartes that he attacked in the very beginning, that we should always question the truth of everything. His first objection is that we can't dispense with disregarding some bad ideas by intuition simply because there are so many of them. In other words, it would be impractical to peruse them all for truthfulness. We wouldn't have the time or energy. So he gives the example of a research lab, saying, the possibilities and resources of any laboratory, be it ever so well endowed, are always finite. Someone must choose among lines of research to pursue, usually on the basis of an intuition as to which is likely to be the most scientifically profitable. Emphasizing that you can't consider every conceivable idea, he adds, Mill, it seems, has not sufficiently frequented the company of crackpots in saloon bars to appreciate this. He concludes by saying, authority is necessary to the accumulation of knowledge. Here I point out that there is a difference between authority and respect for justifiably earned reputations, which depend on knowledge. Secondly, he believes that Mill acts as godfather to an idea that is not strictly his, namely that one opinion is as good as another, even in matters of fact. Now again, I don't believe that just because Mill suggested questioning everything, he's to blame for some people coming to the related mistaken conclusion that one opinion is as good as another. But Dalrymple wants to blame Mill, at least in an indirect way, for this too. Thirdly, Dalrymple argues that even if this motto of questioning everything was practical for Mill or Descartes, since they were intellectuals, most people aren't and don't make a habit of thinking as much as they did. As he says, Mill was led to an unrealistic view of both human beings and the society in which they lived. He was inclined to suppose that most people either were or could become with sufficient education, like himself. Mill generally overestimated the role that reasoning did, or very well could, play in normal day-to-day life. Thus, he's implying that the need to accept things from authority and be prejudiced for most people. Fourthly, and finally, he attacks Mill on the grounds that a partial reading of Mill leads to unbridled egotism. Why in God's name would this be? Because according to him, Mill always suggested again that people think for themselves, and thus the average person is led to think that their own opinions are actually better than they actually are. Otherwise, why rely on them so much? As he says about these people, conformity to any rule is felt as a wound to personal sovereignty, as is the exercise of any authority exterior to that of the ego. He claims that from this attitude, British society has been directly led to flouting many valuable customs, and that have now been tossed to the wayside because people are indirectly following Mill and questioning everything, thinking they know better how to behave in public. As a mild example, he offers the case of a young woman who entered a train compartment and put her feet up on it. He doesn't say with or without shoes, while sitting near him. He asked her politely to remove them. She justified herself initially, and although she removed them eventually, then put them back up again after he had left to get off the train. This example is then used to illustrate the basic mechanism whereby public standards of behavior in all British society are being degraded. He then additionally claims that people feel they have more rights, saying, rights expand to meet the egos of those for whom freedom is nothing but unconstrained action. An example here would be people thinking they have a right to play their music loudly, disturbing others in the street or in densely settled neighborhoods. Let's now briefly mention some arguments and points he makes. Number one, he believes that Mill's radical individualism in the end leads paradoxically to increasing the power of government over individuals, giving, as an alleged example, a father and son pair of window cleaners who were forbidden by the now increased regulatory oversight of the British state from cleaning his windows, requiring him to clean them himself, which brought even more danger than the regulation was designed to prevent. Number 2, he believes the prejudicial idea that everyone should have equality of opportunity, which is absurd given, for example, that everyone is born to different parents, is an inevitable consequence of the desire to eliminate prejudices, though I don't see how this follows. Number 3, he believes that prejudice is actually a requirement for benevolence towards others. Again, I don't see how this follows. Number 4, he believes that human beings need to follow moral commandments which can't be justified, which sounds very strange coming from Dalrymple, an admitted atheist. And finally, number 5, he believes that there is no virtue without prejudice. As I will subsequently explain, there is no particular reason to believe that this is true either. So in conclusion, I would judge in praise of prejudice in 3 areas. First, by how well as a writer he expresses his thoughts and feelings and leads us along his argument so we can understand it well. In this, I would give him a 10 out of 10, given that he is vastly well-read, extraordinarily capable of expressing the slightest nuance of thought and feeling, and thus helps us intimately confront the power of his ideas. Secondly, I would judge him by his ability to describe life in modern England, the life that he, as a prison psychiatrist, has encountered for decades, and by how accurate his descriptions are. In this, as in the first instance, he provides almost an ideal example of the public intellectual, having enormous experience among the lower classes and those in prison, and a superb ability to see the world around him objectively. Here, too, I would give him a 10 out of 10. The third area is by whether he has explained to us the reasons why all these bad things that he has described so well are happening. And here he falters, meaning that I would only give him a 6 out of 10. So overall, even though combining the 3 areas I'd give this book an A-, I think he crucially misunderstands in some respects the nature of prejudice and its causes. Let me explain in more detail. First, we can simply think of prejudices, from the point of view of his argument, as inherited ideas, inherited as children from our parents, from our culture and the society we live in. Some of these ideas are good and others bad, and this he constantly admits and stresses throughout. The first problem arises, however, in that he assumes that once inherited ideas are acquired, we can never, as we grow older and become adults, turn them into consciously accepted beliefs. But we can. That's what it means to be an adult. So contrary to his claim that most people aren't like Mill, thinking a lot and becoming highly educated, everyone can do this to some degree and has the responsibility to do so. Now, it's true, as he implies, that we only have a limited amount of time in life and therefore must economize on all we do, including thinking about whether our inherited beliefs are true. So it's true that, having perhaps accepted hundreds of ideas, as we've grown up, we can't necessarily review them all for their accuracy. But we can, and actually do, review many of them, the important ones, and we review lots of them in school and on a continuing basis throughout life. Secondly, his idea that all prejudices are necessarily replaced with other prejudices certainly seems false, since it implies that human beings always have the same level of irrationality throughout the ages. So, for example, ideas about slavery are now gone forever. What prejudice has replaced them? The belief in the supernatural, that God intervenes in daily life all the time, has been decreasing in the West since the Reformation, which means that most people understand now that science and philosophy, not God, explain the world better. What prejudice has replaced that? Thirdly, the prejudices in favor of fascism and communism, which almost destroyed the world in the 20th century, have now greatly receded. Have they really been replaced by something equally evil in every respect? Thirdly, and most crucially, he misunderstands how prejudices are formed in societies, and it's not from the philosophy and individualism of J.S. Mill. Instead, as I've described in many videos on this channel, prejudices and ideologies are very often caused by the state, which can be highly influential in being able to indoctrinate people with false ideas. In my review of James Lindsay's Race Marxism, I pointed out that the whole history of Christianity was privileged by the use of state violence against those who disagreed. And ironically, when the state no longer killed people who disagreed with the Catholic Church, it lost most of its societal power after the Reformation. The result? Many Catholic prejudices simply vanished into thin air because the power of the state was no longer used to indoctrinate children in schools and churches and to torture and kill those who disagreed with Catholic dogma. Dalrymple's misunderstanding of this crucial point of the origin of prejudices is illustrated most starkly in his misunderstanding of why the British lower classes, as part of the welfare state, sometimes act in ways that they do, why illegitimacy rates are so high, why ignorance and violence abound, and why this degree of barbarism has returned. Because criminal behavior, as he himself describes so well, isn't punished, with individual burglars getting away with hundreds of robberies. Because, as he describes, public education miseducates so many British children, and because the welfare state motivates those receiving benefits to game the system for all it's worth. The more dysfunctionality you exhibit, the more benefits you'll get. And this is the true cause of the prejudicial attitudes that he describes welfare recipients so often having, not the philosophy of J.S. Mill. It would be utterly surprising if, given all that they can get away with, these people weren't arrogant, ungrateful, violent, and unable to raise their children properly. All these attitudes and prejudices are entirely expected as the inevitable consequence of big government and its ability to damage, psychologically and intellectually, the people affected by it. Ironically, Dalrymple himself, in his book Life at the Bottom, describes to a T, on pages 245 and beyond of the Kindle version, the change that occurred to Indian migrants. He says, "I first noticed signs of a developing Indian underclass a few years ago in the prison in which I work. 8 years ago, most of the Indian prisoners were guilty of white-collar crime. All that has changed now. Burglary, street robbery, car theft, and drug dealing with their attendant violence have become so commonplace among them." In this, he again attributes everything to ideas and acculturation, and misses the fact that this change has occurred among some Indians because of the incentives provided and their exposure to the welfare state, the same incentives that have so damaged the white underclass. So he misunderstands the root cause of the growth of their prejudices and their increasing membership of Indian migrants in the lower class. That about wraps up Dalrymple. Incidentally, regarding a prejudice for French women, I would note that our author himself divides his national residence between England and France. Is that time there all spent eating brie cheese and not flirting with any of the French mademoiselles? I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.